Professor, as you said, what you have is a theory. It seems to me that at the heart of your theory are two glaring omissions. First, you said that, going back to Canada, and you omitted culture. Now, nobody in Canada does not sleep at night because the US invaded when Canada was a British colony. People are comfortable in Canada that US will not invade because culturally they do not mind who will be in power in 10 or 15 years because, as you said, we don't know who that is. But we do know what the culture of the US is. We know what the culture of Canada is. Drawing that comparison to China, we get to the position that China has never been a world expansive power, and it is against its culture. Its culture is to be dominant of its region, but there is nothing in its culture that suggests that it would want to invade or dominate US or Australia. The second omission in your theory is an assumption. It's an assumption that the world has to be unipolar, not to be in conflict. In fact, the most successful period in world history in terms of liberalism, in terms of free borders, and in terms of trade was 1870 to 1914, when the world was multipolar. I was wondering how you respond to those two omissions.
Yeah. I think your point that you only get peace in unipolarity, right? What I'm saying there is that in a unipolar world, you only have one great power. So therefore, you can't have great power war. You can have great power wars in bipolarity because there are two great powers, or in multipolarity, as you said, because there are three or more great powers. But also, as you pointed out, you don't have constant war. As you pointed out, from 1870 to 1914, no great power war in Europe, right? Also, from 1815 to 1853, that's the Crimean War, 1815 to 1853, that's another big window where you didn't have war. But you did have great power wars. In unipolarity, you cannot have a great power war because there's only one great power. So that was my point. My point is unipolarity's gone, right? And we now have three great powers, the United States, Russia, and China. And the two great powers that matter are China and the United States. And the argument that I'm making is this is a fundamentally different world than the unipolar world that we knew from 1990 up until 2017. Okay, so that's the argument. Now, your more important point is the point about culture. He's correct. There's no culture in my story. It's just very important to understand that. There's no domestic politics in my story. I don't care whether China's an authoritarian state or it's a democracy. There are a number of my friends who believe that if China was a democracy, Japan's a democracy, India's a democracy, the United States is a democracy, we would live happily ever after. This, Tony, is the sort of argument that in a democracy, you have enlightened people who share the same values, who get along, and so forth and so on. I disagree with that. But of course, we're never going to run that test because China is not a democracy. But with regard to culture, I don't believe, I may be wrong. Again, I don't want to say I'm right, you're wrong. But I don't believe that culture matters. I believe that if you look at Chinese history carefully, they have been a remarkably expansive country over time, right? I have a former graduate student who wrote a book on this. I can give you the citation for the book that lays this out in considerable detail. There's some people who believe that China has a Confucian culture, right? Whenever I go to China and people say, oh, we have a Confucian culture, we never cause any problems, you cause all the problems. I always say, I've heard that somewhere before. I think it's called American exceptionalism. Right? We never cause any problems. It's always the other guys who cause all the problems.
But just quickly, John, how does your thesis then apply to interwar Germany? Do you really think that Weimar Germany, a democracy, would have gone down the route of militarism in World War II just like Hitler and the Nazis did?
Yeah, this I do believe that that Weimar Germany was expansive. It was bent on changing the status quo. It was bent on changing the borders that the Versailles Treaty had created after World War I. I think Stresemann was interested in revisionism. And I believe Germany would have pushed for World War II in the absence of Hitler. But I would be a fool to argue that Hitler didn't matter. But where Hitler really mattered was that he brought Murder Incorporated along with the army. So it was not only an expansive power in the sense that it was interested in dominating Europe in a geopolitical sense, it was also interested in murdering huge numbers of people. By my count, and I could run through the numbers if I had the time, but I won't, I believe that the Germans in World War II murdered 22 million people, okay? You know, the number's often given that the Soviets lost 24 million people. Most of those were lost at the hands of the Germans. Most of them were civilians, right? And they murdered huge numbers of POWs as well. This was Murder Incorporated. This is what you got with the Nazis, right? So you had this sort of geopolitical imperative that I described driving Nazi Germany. And on top of that, you had Murder Incorporated. And I believe you would not have had that with Weimar Germany.
Okay, so that's a weakness in your thesis.
Yes, but let me just say one word. I don't want to get into this in any detail. No theory can account for everything, right? It's very important to understand that a theory is a simplification of reality. The fact that I leave culture out, that I leave domestic politics out, that I leave individuals like Hitler out, right, does show you that the theory has limits. And this is why I may be proved wrong. I'm going to be humble here, really. But at the same time, I would just say I do believe that there is a lot of history that backs me up. And again, let's hope I'm wrong.